Bună ziua și bine ați venit la o nouă discuție marca Ziarul Financiar despre piața ITNC. Astăzi vom discuta despre tendințele din industrie și tehnologie, alături de unul dintre speakerii invitați la cea de-a 8-a ediție a Microsoft Envision Forum, eveniment care aduce în prim plan cele mai noi trenduri din industrie în ceea ce privește transformarea digitală și inovația. Astfel, invitatul de astăzi, care va fi prezent în cadrul ediției din acest an a evenimentului, care va avea loc în data de 24 și 25 martie, este Shara Evans, technologist, futurist și keynote speaker. Hi Shara, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Adrian. It's my delight to be part of your interview series. Thank you for having me.
First of all, let me ask you, how would you describe the term of technology futurist and the kind of role you play?
Well, I'll try to give you a short description rather than a very, very long one. So, number one, I'm a technologist and have been for my entire adult life. I'm also a sci fi geek and have been since I was a very little girl. So, I've always been interested in the future and all kinds of things related to the future. But I'm also a researcher and I have a very good imagination. And I also am, I would say, a scientist in many ways. I'm definitely an engineer, a qualified engineer, and I mesh it all together into looking at a whole range of different technologies and also looking at what's happening in the geopolitical front and the environmental front and in a lot of different areas, mesh it all together and come up with a range of different scenarios and timelines, and then boil it down to the one that I think is the most likely to happen given where we're at now with different technological advancements and also things that are happening on the world stage. So it's a combination of technology, but also looking at the bigger world picture.
I think it's clear we are already living an era of interconnected things. Where do you see humanity as we are going into the future?
Oh boy, that's such a big question. I mean, right now, we are just so reliant on our gadgets, and we're becoming more so with each passing day, especially now in the middle of a pandemic. My gosh, if we did not have our gadgets, most of us would probably be out of work. And even people who are not in the technology industry or using technology specifically would be having a very hard time of it. But looking again, through the lens of a futurist, scientists are working on some really, really interesting things that are going to impact what it means to be human. So, one of the things that's interesting me from a healthcare perspective is smart contacts. So, if you can imagine contact lenses that have all the kinds of apps that you have in your smartphone, plus augmented or virtual reality, plus biotech apps that are able to use the chemicals in your tear ducts to figure out what's happening in your body or measure whether you've got a pre-glaucoma condition happening and so on. You can start to see where we're going to have this evolution of technology impacting our lives in an increasing manner. And then going beyond that, there is a lot of research happening even with implantable devices in our brains. Now, from a medical perspective, we've had implants for many decades now. Think about pacemakers and hearing aids and so on. But those are all for medical purposes, and that will continue. But where a lot of the research is starting to look right now, and commercial companies as well as universities are looking at these implantables using AI to put into our brains and literally wiring us as human beings to an AI and connected to the net. And I don't know whether people will accept it. I'm certainly not going to be first to line up to have that sort of thing in my brain. I honestly don't want everybody knowing every fleeting thought that's going through my head. But we're on the cusp of some really dramatic changes. And again, going to advanced healthcare, which is one of my passions, there are some other really exciting things that are happening that are going to impact human health and longevity. And one of them has to do with research in the area of stem cells. And basically, we can harvest stem cells from our own body, actually, from excess fat on our own body. If you can imagine, the stuff that a lot of people don't like on their body is actually the potential fountain of youth to be able to regrow skin, which is possible right now, or cartilage, and even experimentally, like little tiny miniature human hearts. So someday, probably about 10 years from now, we might be in a position where if we need an organ transplant, we'll take stem cells from our own body, bioprint it, and it's basically a type of 3D printing, but with bio ink, biological ink, and we'll grow a replacement heart or a replacement liver, and we won't be reliant on transplants. That's going to be a dramatic change. And then there's genetic engineering. And we're finally starting to map out the human genome. We don't understand what all the billions of genes do yet, but when we do, we might be able to find the switch that controls aging, maybe reverse it, maybe give us tremendously longer lives, maybe even do things like change our ability to survive in different environments, like being able to breathe underwater, growing gills, or be able to adapt our bodies to live on a planet that has a different gravity than our own, or be able to take into our bodies much higher radiation levels than we could living here on planet Earth. These are just some of the really exciting changes that are happening. And I could go on and on and on about advanced healthcare, but that will radically change what it means to be human in the decades to come. This isn't something that's going to happen next year. I'm talking, sort of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years out. But there's a progression from where we're at now to where we're going to go as a species.
The idea of keeping all our data in the cloud and being able to access it anywhere, anytime, is an increasingly popular concept these days. How do you see this shaping how we view and use technology?
Do you know, I was actually asked that question about 20 years ago at a conference. And I remember back at that time, I said, where we're going with cloud is accessing data anywhere, anytime from any device. And that's exactly what we're doing right now. But one of the things to bear in mind when we have cloud based systems is that not all cloud systems are equal. So some have better security than others. Some cloud systems respect privacy and others sell data. Some are housed or designed in a way that is much more resilient to attacks or data breaches than others. So it's really important for us as individuals or as representatives of a company to make sure that when we use a cloud service, we actually understand the terms and conditions and a bit about how they store data, how they use our data. You're in Romania, which is part of the EU. So, of course, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is really important, and that goes to privacy. And once again, there are a lot of platforms where you click, on I agree, a legal agreement that you're basically waiving your rights to privacy. And I would say to people, if you're getting something for free, there is usually no such thing as a free lunch. Usually, if you're getting something for free, then you're the product and not you as an individual, but the data that you generate. And be very wary, just make sure you know what you're doing. And, cloud services are absolutely wonderful. I use a lot of them. In the pandemic, I think if we didn't have cloud services, that most of us across the planet would not be working at all. So I'm definitely a supporter of cloud services, but I say, buyer beware of which providers you use.
We are now working from home, learning from home, and even participating to industry events out of our homes. What are some key privacy issues people should be aware of, and what are some simple steps they can take to protect themselves?
Okay, so number one, make sure you've got, on your computer, you want to make sure you've got antivirus, malware checking. You might, if you're a company, you definitely want a VPN. Even as an individual, you might want a VPN. You definitely want to have firewalls on your computer and on whatever gateway into your home or office that you have. So multiple firewalls make it as hard as possible for somebody to get to your networks. If you're using a Wi-Fi network, do not use the free Wi-Fi networks that do not have that encryption, secure encryption, because what you're doing is essentially putting your data broadcast for anybody who's got a Wi-Fi sniffer to be able to sniff it out, and it's not at all secure. If you're using email and you're sending sensitive information, do not ever send sensitive information unless it's encrypted. So it's so easy to encrypt data just using your normal email. So let's say I want to send something that's sensitive to you, and I can put it inside a Microsoft Word document and then put a password on it, and that has encryption so that I can just send it with plain email. So it's not a drama for you to get it. I just need to send you the password. And the way I would do it is I'd send the document maybe by email, but I'd call you up and tell you the password, or I might send you the password by SMS. So they're going through two completely different channels, meaning that if somebody manages to intercept an email, they're not going to intercept the password too. It's just some really basic stuff. Another thing I would say is that a lot of companies, and social media companies in particular, but almost any shopping, retail online store, they might ask you for your birth date or other private information. And you need to decide, does that company really need to have my birth date, or is it just something that they'd like to have because it might help their marketing? So I have a rule. I never ever put my date of birth on social media in the public domain. Absolutely not. If a company wants me to buy something and they're asking for a date of birth, I'll probably abandon my shopping cart, and at the very best, I'll put a completely wrong birth date, probably 30 or 40 years off in either direction. So I probably have about 1,000 different birth dates out there in different places. So if somebody ever tried to steal my identity, unless they actually got into a bank or a government account where I have to give my real birth date, then they're not going to get my real birth date. They're going to get something that I've just made up on the fly with all kinds of different data. And that's something that most people should do. I think most people are not aware of the fact that they should not be putting their birth dates up on social media websites. Look, it's always really nice to get a happy birthday card from somebody, but is it worth risking your identity? Probably not. Unfortunately, a birth date is the one piece of identity that you can never, ever change unless you die. So be very wary of that one. And I think that we need to build privacy and security into the products and services that are designed and sold either to consumers or businesses. And it has to be right at the design process up front, not a bolt-on afterthought. And I'd also add ethics needs to be part of that whole design process as well, because that goes to the heart of security and freedom and keeping a person safe. And a lot of companies just don't adhere to those principles. And I think that we, as consumers and as representatives of companies, need to insist that that is something that has to be part of a product or service that we utilize.
Thank you for some great piece of advice. Even if some of them, I think they came a little bit too late for me. At least I'm thinking that I gave my birth date to a lot of companies, and it's a little late to change it. Also, I think it's a great advice, the one to send documents in an encrypted form and then sending the password. It's quite easy, as you said, but I think it needs a change in behavior, and that might be a little bit difficult to do things as you recommended. So let me
Well,
ask you. So please.
I was going to say, I really think public education is needed. Most people seem to have this idea, even companies, that email is secure. And the reality is, and believe me, I'm a hardcore technologist. I've designed data networks like the protocols from scratch. So when I say, I know this stuff, I really do. It's not, you can have it encrypted at some points while it's being transmitted, but it's not encrypted end to end unless you're using a very specialized, unless both parties are using a specialized email client. And most people, and even most companies, are not aware of that fact. And I think that if companies made people aware that this is a very useful way of exchanging information, but if we need to change information that is confidential, then we need to add that extra layer, and it could be through password encryption of a document, whether it be an office document or a PDF, or even using a zip file with encryption. There's so many really, really easy ways that we can protect ourselves, and people don't do it. So it's education.
You pointed out some great things. Let me ask you another question. What's your view? What changed after COVID-19, and what should we expect next?
Oh gosh, so much has changed since COVID-19. I'm not sure how your working life has changed as a journalist. But certainly for me, I'm a professional speaker, and up until COVID-19, Um, if I were doing an event in Romania, I would be flying to Romania and coming in early enough to take a tour of the city and meet with the people that are organizing the event and doing, things like a VIP breakfast or lunch and getting to meet delegates and meeting all kinds of really wonderful people from all over the world. But I don't get to do that virtually. And it's, very hard to do that virtually. But if it wasn't for virtual, then, the events wouldn't happen at all. I think a lot of people are experiencing really big changes to the way that they work. So if you're in a large company, you're probably accustomed to being in an office where you've got people around you and you have that chance to have that, social water cooler chat, or go out to lunch together, or go out after, the workday is ended, and maybe have a meal together or go and work out at a gym together. And all of that has, for most parts of the world, disappeared. And I think that there's a lot of social isolation that has crept in as a result of all these lockdowns that happen on and off around the world. And I wish I had a magic wand and could just make the virus disappear, like just poof off the planet Earth, every single variant. Unfortunately, I don't have that magic wand. But what I do know is that COVID is a virus, and viruses mutate, and we're already starting to see different strains of COVID appear in different parts of the world. And one of my biggest fears as a futurist, and especially as someone who looks at advanced healthcare and the medical side and talks to researchers in that area, is that we're going to see different variants. And no matter how diligent we are in trying to get vaccines out as quickly as possible, the virus may actually beat us to being able to develop potential cures. And we're going to end up in a state of being in lockdown, being opened up, back in lockdown, open up, and that this could last for a number of years. I think, and I hope I'm wrong. Seriously, I hope I'm wrong, Adrian. I think it will be 2023 at the earliest before we start to see any kind of semblance of a more normal, if I can use that word, mode of being, but it could take a lot longer. And a lot of it just depends on what happens with this virus. And it's a wild card because of the way that it's mutating. But eventually, and here's the good news, is that one of the areas of technology that has been researched by many labs around the world for at least a decade now is nanotech. And these are teensy, teensy little robots. They're microscopic. And if we actually had COVID fighting robots in our bodies that were able to detect the smallest sign, they'd be tinier than the virus. So they'd actually be able to defeat the virus. And that's one of the challenges we have now, is that it's so small that the medications and things that we have are challenged. But if we had that kind of technology protecting us, that might actually just wipe it out. So I remain hopeful, and I hope that technology might help us get through this. And certainly it will help us stay connected and help with some of the social isolation as well.
What do you think is the major advantage that AI and robotics have on different industry verticals and businesses?
First of all, I would say AI, including robotics, it's an umbrella term. It encompasses so many different technologies. And it also is used to describe techniques like deep learning and machine learning, but it encompasses things like chatbots and image recognition and facial recognition and um, things like natural speech recognition. So being able to understand someone's voice and the emotion from someone's voice or the expression on their face. And of course, there's physical robots and drones and driverless cars. And there are just so many different aspects of AI that we could literally spend hours talking about it. But what I do see is that no matter what industry I look at, there is a place where some type of AI, and it might be different for different industries, could be really useful. So if you're an organization that has a website or customer service, chatbots of, whether they be text-based or voice-based, might be really useful for you. If you're a company that has really, really big data sets and maybe multiple data sets, the ability of AI to take in these data sets and analyze them and start reaching conclusions, which may or may not be right, and that's where you need human intervention, but that can help us get through terabytes of data in a matter of seconds, and then have a human look at the results and say, hang on, that looks right, or that doesn't look right. So I still think we need a human in the loop. It doesn't replace a human. When it comes to robots, again, there's some amazing applications, and it depends on the industry that we're talking about. When it comes to fighting COVID, some that I really like right now are the disinfectant robots that use ultraviolet light to literally really sanitize an area completely. It just destroys, the sunlight, UV, it destroys the virus. And there are even portable mobile doors that you can put in front of a building that can do UV types of different disinfection when somebody comes through. So there are all kinds of innovations. When it comes to agriculture, there are robots that are able, with the sensors that they have on them, to be able to detect the levels of nutrients in soil, to be able to count flower buds, to be able to detect fungus, mold, and pests, and things that would be very difficult, if not impossible, for a human to do, and to also do picking of, delicate produce. And again, we're talking about areas where it may be difficult to get labor, because it's seasonal and they're in regional areas. So a lot of good uses, warehouses, lots and lots of robots, contactless deliveries. I could just keep going on and on and on and on about the potential uses for AI, but there are a lot. But again, you know, even AI is using a large data set. The thing to be aware of is that data set may contain incorrect information. So that old saying, garbage in, garbage out, that's really important. And the data set may also contain social biases that are not overtly there, but if you put them all together and an AI is analyzing, terabytes of data, it might draw conclusions that a human reading one page wouldn't draw. And then you just, again, need a human in the loop to make sure that the AI is behaving in the way that you would want a human being assessing that information to behave.
That's really correct. You pointed out again a very interesting thing that if we put wrong data into the AI, are going to get wrong conclusions. But let's stay on the positive side. What would be
Okay.
what would be the AI's major advantage for the humanity? What holds the future for us, and how can we best leverage all the opportunities that the technology, AI solutions, and robotics will bring?
So with AI, one of the biggest advantages that a human cannot do is analyzing, doing pattern matching on absolutely massive, massive data sets. We just don't have the capacity as physical humans to go through that much data in boom, practically no time. So that's a major advantage. But again, you need the human to make sure the conclusions are right. Another big advantage is AI and healthcare. So, one of the examples I like to draw is that if you can imagine that you've got a series of two-dimensional CT scans, perhaps taken 6 months apart, you've got a radiographer and a radiologist who are looking at these two-dimensional images, but they might not be able to pick up really minute details because of just the limits of the human eye and the way that our brains work. But an AI is able to piece these two-dimensional scans into a three-dimensional image that you can then sort of turn around maybe in virtual reality and start looking at things in a different way, and then do a time series and pick out what's changed. So let's say somebody has developed a brain tumor and you're using this technique and looking at a series of images, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, and yesterday, an AI could pick out changes, perhaps, especially subtle changes, more rapidly than a trained scientist would be able to do, or a trained medical professional, but you would not want it to do it on its own. So basically, you'd have the AI doing the assembly of these three-dimensional images, and you'd have the medical professional doing the assessment of the images. And that's a really good use. Another really good use, and this time I'll talk about robots, is that we can get robots into areas where it's not safe for humans to go. So here in Sydney on the Harbour Bridge for the last 8 or 9 years, we've actually had robots that are completely autonomous, that are able to get into this intricate steel girder infrastructure and look at places where there's rust, because you've got to be able to maintain the bridge. And they're too small for a human to get into. And even if they could, it wouldn't be very safe and do things like grid blasting. Another place that robots have gotten into that, again, not safe for humans, is Fukushima, right after the nuclear disaster. And as we start exploring outer space, if you can imagine that the robotic probes and, eventually maybe even humanoid type robots or other types of robots might be the first ones out there that might build the colonies for us or build the stations for us, this can be tremendously beneficial because they're doing things that might be risky for a human to do, and they're helping us, So they're not a threat to us. They're actually a companion and a tool that we're using. And it's a tool that we're using wisely as opposed to a tool that we're using haphazardly.
Probably the most important challenge brought by the pandemic was related to the workforce. As we can see right now, also during this interview, I'm working from home. You are also not traveling anymore abroad to be part of these conferences. So let me ask you, what do you think about these changes, and what is the evolution you see in the future from this point of view? I'm thinking a lot of employees and also of business owners are asking themselves what's going to be in the future. Are they going to be back in the office, or we are going to see a hybrid mode of working for the foreseeable future from now on?
We're looking at the near term future, and from a just in general as a futurist, outside of the pandemic, I would say near term future is much easier to predict from a technology perspective because I'd be looking at, what's commercial, what's nearly commercial, and so on and so forth. The pandemic has thrown a complete wild card into near term forecasts because we just do not know what's going to happen with the mutation of the virus. However, I would place money on the fact that I think remote working is here to stay, and it may likely evolve into part of the time you're in the office and part of the time you're working from home. I think a lot of people are becoming accustomed to work life balance where they have the flexibility and now the trust of their company that they actually can be trusted to work from home. And that was actually the biggest barrier to working from home in the past was the trust issue. We had the technology to be able to do remote collaboration, but for some reason a lot of companies just thought, well, if I can't keep my eye on people, then how do I know that they're really working? Well, in the pandemic they've had no choice to trust that their people are working, and guess what, it turned out that people are probably working harder now than they might have in the past, but they've got the flexibility to be able to take care of a little one or go take a pet for a walk or do whatever they have to do in their household. But then they'll come back and work even longer hours because they're not spending the time commuting. So if I were to say, okay, let's look sort of post pandemic, things are a bit more under control than they are now. I think that we'd probably be looking at maybe 2 days in the office and 3 days at home, or maybe flipped around 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. But I think companies are also seeing that, you know what, if we need less commercial real estate, that's going to cost us a bit less. We don't need as much space. And if people are working remotely and we've got good telecommunication systems, then maybe we don't need to have our head office in the middle of the most expensive city areas. And unfortunately, that has some downsides for commercial real estate and all the businesses that rely on the trade from people who come in and out of the offices. But I think we're just going to see this hybrid mix of sometimes working from home and sometimes working from an office, depending on the nature of what's happening at any given point in time. And unfortunately, if we end up in a situation where we get another flare up of the pandemic or another variation, of the virus, and we need to go back into a lockdown, then we've got this backup plan that says, okay, our business doesn't go out of business, our people just are working from home. But the flip side of that is I talked about savings in commercial real estate, but if companies are expecting people to be working from their home in on a long-term basis, they need to have big screens to be productive. They need to have the right kinds of computer, like not use the family computer, use a dedicated personal computer from the company, have VPNs and firewalls and all the other security. And they might need a big screen so they get more productivity. They might need better ergonomic furniture. And staff might say, well, look, this is taking up a big portion of my house. I think I should be paid some amount because I'm paying, I need to have a bigger space than I'm either purchasing or renting to be able to accommodate this. I need to be compensated either in terms of more salary or a direct stipend, or I'm using more electricity because I've got all these work things in my house that are very intensive on my electric bill. And by the way, Mr. and Mrs. Employer, um, I need you to help me out with that too. So we're going to see some changes, I think. But what I get concerned about is that lack of socialization that we get when we actually get to interact in a person to person manner. And, you and I, we're getting to know each other a little bit through video, but it's not the same as if we actually were meeting in person and had a bit of a chat ahead of time and had a coffee afterwards and so on. It's just not the same when you never get to meet a person live.
Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion. We are looking forward to watch you at the Microsoft Envision Forum. Until then, can you share with us a few ideas that you are going to tackle at this event?
Well, I don't want to steal the thunder from the event, but I will definitely be talking about artificial intelligence and giving some examples there. I will be talking a little bit about sustainability and some technologies relating to that. I'll be giving people some ideas of some new investment areas. And I will be talking a bit about outer space too, because I see that as a new frontier of lots and lots of opportunities. And of course, that's just a couple of tidbits. I don't want to give it all away.
We are looking forward to watch you at the Microsoft Envision Forum at the end of March.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I appreciate you having me on your show. Have a great day.
Dacă doriți să aflați mai multe despre cum vede viitorul Shara Evans, urmăriți-o în cadrul evenimentului Microsoft Envision Forum, care va avea loc online pe 24 și 25 martie. Până atunci, vă mulțumim pentru că ne-ați urmărit. La revedere!